front.
Okay, so I suppose to start, I would like to say that we need to remember that we're in a much better position now with regard to our communication with Cathy and the Commission for Aviation. My previous experience would have been that it was a lot of letter writing. So I think we've really kind of evolved in our communication process with CAR, and in particular, I would commend Cathy on her involvement and engagement in the last couple of months. She's attended 2 board meetings, and I think that certainly is something that has never been seen in the history of the ITAA. So I would thank you for that, Cathy. No, it's not all good, unfortunately. Right? There's always a but. I think it's very unfair what's happening in the trade at the minute, because we're all out there doing our best, trying to run our business, providing you with whatever demands that you're making on us, and it's quite costly for us to provide you with all these figures and projections and constant demands. But the one question that I would ask you is, what have you actually done internally, right, to stop this happening? Because I think, we all have a confidence issue around we're providing the figures, we're providing the correct figures, so what's happening on your end that this is actually going wrong?
Do you want to take the question, Cathy? I was actually going to go through the 4, but you can take a question on the hoof, or you can take them as you prefer.
Well, I suppose, look, it's worth saying a few words about low cost and how we got to the position we're in now. They made an application like you all do. They thought this is the third one, was one of 2015 in July, August. They made an application. They gave us the right financial information. They gave us some management accounts as well. And as we do for many of you, we asked them for management accounts and other, but I have to say, unaudited figures, because some of you might be around in the industry long enough to know that the Commission for Aviation Regulation used to ask for audited 6 monthly statements, but for a number of reasons, a number of years ago, that was dropped. So one of the things I've learned from that, I suppose the comment to make first is that the information presented to us was inconsistent with the level of claims that we saw when it went into collapse. So, and that's quite an important thing. Now we have administrators, 3 sets of administrators are now looking at low cost, and I think they're over in Switzerland at the moment. There's lots of different companies with different interactions with each other, but they're in their 2nd year, and it's taken too long, I know this, but they say it's very, very complex, and there's a vast amount of information they're trying to get their hands on. Because the question we want answered is, what was the basis of the information we were given? Who gave us that information? And what was the veracity of that information? So, as I've said to you before, when I've spoken to a number of you, when we get clarity on that, we'll then decide what action we take, but we'll also update yourselves, because that's only right and proper. So the one thing, as it said at the start there, we had a reliance on unaudited information, and that is one thing I'm looking at now, particularly for those companies that have, and I'm not discriminating, is those companies, say, who cover a number of markets that might have some licensable turnover in the UK, in Ireland, France, Germany, wherever, to get a much, much more firm understanding of how they determine the figures for Ireland. And to that extent, we're in the process of setting up visits now for a good number of companies set in the UK and in Amsterdam to get to the bottom of that. And the other thing we're asking these people to provide us with is audited information. Now, I know for a lot of you that's a huge burden and a costly burden, but we have discussed this with the ITAA, and I'm just saying, look, I'm very interested in your views. Should there be a minimum size of company that we should be asking this information from that would be reasonable, or not? Or is there another approach that we can take to actually get to be able to get information that we can rely upon without placing too much of a burden on yourselves? That's one point. Second point is, 4 points just. The second point is that, and I think this is where we went amiss. I did not know the information in the market about low cost and the concerns that were there, and you did. And so if in some way that I can work with yourselves more this year to actually get a better feel for the market and market trends and developments. And to that end, we've been increasing the number of visits that we've done already, but we'll intend to visit more of you, I will personally, over the course of the year, and then to continue that. and maybe talk to a number of you in more detail. If you represent the views of a number of people, again, I want to get a better feel for the market and what the market trends are. And the final point is, you asked me what are we doing internally. Well, I've taken apart really the whole of the licensing bonding process and the financial evaluation over the last number of months. And I put in place more onerous internal requirements. And it's not that, I suppose when I went through the process, I could see where I would want to get more involved. So there's much more structures around. Personally now, I sign off, you might have noticed, I sign all licenses now. In the past, that mightn't have been the case, but the Commissioner always signed the licence. So I'm putting my name to it, so I have to be assured that I'm satisfied with the analysis that we've carried out for that licence. And that in itself creates the need for more internal processes and meetings, but that's what I'm going to do. I'm just making our processes as best as I can. But at the end of the day, I can't safeguard against someone who provides me with information that's not accurate, and I can't stop a company collapsing overnight for some particular reason. But all I can say to you is I'm doing the best that I can, and I want to work with yourselves to actually see if we can improve things. Last point, you said that you said to us very last that we were asking too much of you in some of the information that the requests we put into you. Now, on the one hand, we need to ask for some information, but I have started going through the application form itself, and I'm challenging people inside our organisation. For example, do we need to know about your back-end office systems or whatever it is? So I'm sort of saying we're going to we've reviewed our financial monitoring process and reviewed our internal process. So I'm now going to review the application itself to see to what extent I can reduce the burden on you, but at the same time being able to stand over, the issuing you with a licence in the first place. Sorry for the long winded.
And Cathy, could you react? Everyone was running for cover in the months before low cost. Could you react to something like that?
Well, it would have been difficult, but the only learning I'm getting from it was if a thought problem, say I even had 2 months heads up on it, and I could have done something 2 months earlier, because ultimately you would pull the licence and cease the trading, and that would have been a saving on the fund. And so, to me, every day would have saved a little bit of money. So, but it's very difficult to put a licence once you've issued it. Your real power is before you issue the licence, and if they don't satisfy you then you don't get one. But you can pull a licence.
Would you do something differently?
Well, what I said there about looking for audit information, yes. I've been making some more onerous requirements on certain groups of travel agents to prove the veracity of the information that they're providing me with. So, yes. Do
you want to come into Paul? We are where we are. What's the next step, Paul? What would you say as someone who's grown a company in this middle of this regulation and in the middle of a recession? There must be ways of operating within the system which are not penal and onerous.
Like if we look at the numbers on the board and the reason that the Travellers Protection Fund needs to be replenished, it was one particular case. So I think what we need to do, we can look at the bonding levels and we can look at levies. Personally, I absolutely despise the thought of us paying, our customers paying a levy for effectively what is low-cost collapse. Because I think any additional charges that we put on our customers just drives them to the DIY market because they're constantly price checking us. So it just makes us less competitive. And whilst €2 on the board or 140 on the board might seem like a small number, multiply that by 10,000 passengers, 20,000 passengers, 40,000 passengers, and relate that number back to your net profit, and you get a very different set of numbers. So from my point of view, the levy just leaves me cold. However, I think what we need to do is work with the Commission and look at how we can de-risk potential future failures. And we need to look at the market and say, well, there's different stages and different levels of companies that exist in the market. And if their turnover is above a certain level, they should have the financial and the accounting backup systems that can provide you with the numbers that you require on a very regular and very clear basis. So we can de-risk where the most risk is, because the bigger companies are the bigger risk and carry the bigger demand on the Travellers Protection Fund. So, I don't know about everybody else in the room, but I think if we can look more closely at how the regulation, how CAR regulate us and how we can work with CAR to de-risk potential future failures, that's a no-cost situation to anybody. And I think our back office systems at this stage really should be good enough and robust enough to provide that data. If they're not, we shouldn't be trading at that level in the first place.
And Pat, do you want to come in? You've been through the houses on this with
we
several
have.
regulators.
1, 2, 3, can you hear me? Yes, we have. I suppose from an association point of view, I've now engaged with 3 different ministers, and there are people around the room here who have engaged with 5 or 6 different ministers for the last 15 or 20 years. And, nothing has really changed yet. So I think we're hoping with a new broom and with Cathy understanding us, and I think at this stage she understands where we are. I totally agree with Eoghan about the legislation. I mean, the excuse of saying we cannot do legislation. Well, legislation can be done with the will, with the power, and with the willpower of the government, and to get to the government. Now, unfortunately, we haven't what you call a very active Minister for Transport. I say that respectfully. And engaging with the association, that has not happened. And having Cathy engaging with the board of the association and with your good selves, having attended 2 of the meetings, we're beginning to understand one another. But our sort of way out of this is, and it's not getting any traction whatsoever, is that there is a 50 cent or a €1 levy on everyone that leaves this country. So that means that you'll have a commissioner and a government who can say that 100% of the people leaving the country are protected and consumers are protected rather than 15%. I mean, to have that allow in a country that 15%, 15 people out of 100 have protection, and to let away 85 people who are unprotected, I think is very, very, very wrong. So I'm hoping that we will have a change of heart, we will have a change of direction, and for once we're listened to, and it's now over 30 years since we haven't been listened to.
Cathy, you can feel free to come in at any stage. You are the star attraction here. So,
No,
legislation.
no, no, just 2 points there is, I know you've made that suggestion before about the one your passenger. That can be your submission to us. I'm not saying don't say that, but I mean there's the risks with every single option that you put forward, and I can see risks with that one as well. But I'm not saying that it's not going to be considered. But it's just that it goes beyond our remit, and that's fine, but we can highlight that in whatever paper we come out with. And the point about legislation, the reason why I said this was done separately to the Package Travel Directive was one, it was really for yourselves because, and you don't necessarily have to agree with this logic, the 1990 directive was transposed into Irish law in 1995. That was a long period of time between the requirements and the actual Irish legislation. I don't know how long it's going to take to sort out the legislation for this one, or is it going to be done with an SI? I don't know, because the department haven't said yet. And so the risk to me was that you had no legislation in place for a number of years, being pessimistic about it, and I might be wrong, I don't know. And then, so if I did nothing on the package, or if I did nothing on the bonding and the fund now until all that got sorted out, there's a real risk then. You've still got the 1.8 in the bond in the fund. You might have a collapse, but in the meantime, the message you give to your customers cannot be you're fully protected because, well, they might not be. And so I thought that was the worst of both worlds. So the approach we decided to take was move forward with making this fund fit for purpose, and to the extent, and it might require legal changes in itself anyway, and to the extent we deal with that. And then we get on with the work on the Package Travel Directive, and as soon as it becomes clear what the department are going to do in terms of making that into legislation, we can either, if they do it quickly, we can stop the piece of work we're doing here and merge it into that one, or if it takes more time, then we have this here, and then we sense check it to make sure that it complies with the directive. So it wasn't a case of saying, well, I'm only going to cut this little bit out here and just look at it by itself, and then I'll look to everything else. It was more just trying to make sure from the passenger's point of view is they got the best benefit, continue to get the benefit out of it.
But Cathy, there are bits being bolted onto legislation. When the Ryanair Holidays clause was really quite recently inserted in Irish legislation, it seems to be the noise that comes from Europe gets this legislation moving. and we've got a truckload of travel legislation
but-
coming through. Can we not? Is it that we're not making enough noise?
It took 5. All I know is from the past, it took 5 years last time round.
And it was out of date. It was out of date almost before it was implemented.
And I think Anne was saying about whatever the legislative programme for next year, and you didn't see anything there about.
I didn't say anything there, but
Doesn't mean it can't happen.
it doesn't mean
And so
my
we'll
own sense is, if I might, is
Sure.
that I kind of think it could well come in under an SI. I think a lot of, if you look at the consumer contracts and cancellations.
And if that is.
came in as an
Sorry
SI.
to interrupt. There you go.
Sorry.
Yeah, we have a microphone.
That came in as an SI, and it was very much a copy and paste. And there's, as I said earlier this morning, quite a degree of scope for that.
But if that's the case, then we can quickly move this piece of work into the other piece of work, because, as I said to you up there, that Norway, it seems, has a scheme quite like ours, and theirs is fit for purpose, they think, under the Package Travel Directive, which is good news in a way. And to me, then, maybe the Package Travel Directive is more about who you include into the scheme, because of the whole debate about whether the airlines are included or not. But that doesn't change the structure of the scheme.
But the per head levy, it might, as my information is, it probably doesn't require legislation. Anne would know more about this, but
It doesn't, as long
it was
as.
already in place.
But
wasn't it?
only for tour operators, which would seem very unfair, seeing as their share of the market is considerably reduced.
So you can't get Michael O'Leary to take a per head, the equivalent of a wheelchair tax.
Not
or
under the
anything.
current legislation, no.
Okay, great. I go to. We have roving microphones, and I've heard a bit of mumbling in the audience. So I want to hear all the mumbles in questions. Richard Cullen here is calling for a mic, and somebody else is calling for a mic.
Thank you. Yeah, Richard from Killiney Travel again. Ryanair Holidays, Expedia, like they're doing package holidays. They sell 2 elements. Are they bonded? Expedia.
Expedia are.
Yeah. Ryanair Holidays?
I can't talk about them because I can't talk about who's in the process of applying for a licence or not.
Okay.
It would be interesting.
Just to answer your question, Richard, when I put the same question to Ryanair was that their German licence covered them in Ireland. That was their, and Ryanair have probably the most highly paid legal advisors that you have going, because they're in court the whole time. So that was their position. So if you end up in a conflict on this, it would be 3 or 4 years in court. Even if you win it, it's a lot of court time. Sorry, Paul wants to come in here.
Richard, in the question to Ryanair Holidays, my understanding is that they're using the Services Directive and saying we're bonded in another EU jurisdiction, and that's what they're doing. And the reality is, if low cost had done the same and there wasn't a licence granted to low cost holidays by car, the Services Directive would have been applied, and there would have been no call on the Travellers Protection Fund. But then those holidaymakers would have been at a loss.
Yes, they wouldn't be.
Yeah, the UK level of compensation on low cost was quite horrendous, compared with the Irish.
Well, that was because they were in the Balearic Islands, and it was like, 7 pence from the pound or something?
Yeah.
7, yeah.
So be careful what you wish for. We might end up with our angry consumers. Yeah.
But to a certain extent, I understand from my colleagues in ABTA that the impact of low cost didn't really hit the marketplace, because most people got recovered by way of a chargeback on their cards.
Right. And that's another, the other people that aren't in the room are the credit card companies, who would be very quick to move, wouldn't they?
Can I just say one thing about the credit cards? Because it's interesting, it's the difference between the UK and here. In the UK, the credit cards have a legal requirement for chargeback, but in Ireland it's not legal, and so they choose to do it. And I think as well, correct me if I'm wrong, debit cards are covered in Ireland by choice, but they're not covered in the UK. So it's different law in the two countries.
Have we a question?
I think the landscape of the travel industry in Ireland is unique because of the dominance of the 2 airlines. So when you talk about Europe and different countries and different examples, they don't have capacity of 75% controlled by 2 airlines, who are also now. The problem the people out there have is that we as travel agents have to compete. And like the 15% is there, but we have to compete and keep our doors open with airlines who are selling off the same street, and we're being imposed with levies. And this is where all these people out here are so annoyed with this. This is the main problem. I mean, if everyone was paying a levy, and remember, if you have €1, you collect 7 million a year, game, set and match, you have your 6 million as such. So everyone was paying the levy of whatever might be across the board, you would have no conversation from these people. The problem is they're trying to put us out of business. And that's the simple reality. You talk to any travel agent here, big or small, and that is the reality of life. They're driving us out of business with your blessing because of the fact you don't impose what you're imposing on us.
But it's you make it sound like I have a choice. I have no choice. It's just the legal. It's the way that.
Get over it. Get over it.
But I can't just impose a levy on someone that I haven't a legal right to impose a levy on. They would fight that, and you know that.
Well,
Paul, you're in the online space. We heard Michelle saying that people will shift custom to say €5. Is it? Do customers buy that? We are bonded. It's going to cost you €4 to be bonded. Do they buy that?
No, I think consumers really struggle with the whole benefit of licence and bonding. I think they just expect things to be sorted for them. So then it becomes a very difficult thing to sell the advantage of, and we're then being facing down an additional charge when the consumer doesn't appreciate it at all. And yes, we're not really facing reality if we don't think, even if that is a small levy and a small charge, the consumer is price checking us all the time. They'll go off after we've quoted them and they'll break down all of the individual prices because that's what they do. They're tuned in.
As a matter of interest, has anyone in the room seen the benefit from the consumers of being bonded? Have they people walk into their shops are contacting them and say, "Oh, I'm going with you because you're licensed and bonded"?
Never.
There's have you a microphone here for?
Nolene Lynch from Atlas Travel GoHop. Just to say that we carried out a survey of our GoHop clients recently, and we asked that question of them, and 100% said it doesn't interest them whatsoever and wouldn't sway them towards buying from an agency if they have protection.
And Owen, just coming back on one thing, whilst the consumer doesn't appreciate that, the other people, Andrew isn't here from AIB Merchant Services, but like we were at the receiving end of some fairly... Oh, you are? Good. I'm glad. If we decide that we don't want a form of bonding, then we're handing control back to some of the credit card companies and the merchant service providers. Yeah. And when we were setting up the business, the single biggest challenge we had was the merchant service providers and the fact that they were looking for additional cash bonds from us, and that will replace a bond that we're holding with car. So on the one hand, we're in a very tricky position. We're representing a minority of consumers who are travelling by giving them this protection. The vast majority are travelling without protection. We're subject to additional legislation, regulation and controls and costs as a result. But yet if we don't work with car towards maintaining some form of protection, the merchant service companies then look at our entire turnover and will put a value on what they think that's going to be and what the risk to them is going to be in the event of a failure. And it won't be a discussion point. It will be, as it was in our case, as it was in your case, an email looking for quite substantial cash amounts.
Actually, just on that note, while Cathy might be the best of a bad lot, right? to drive. But genuinely, I suppose, to back up what Paul is saying there, and from personal experience, at least the Commission have to apply a certain amount of manners to the situation. I would say the merchant service are inclined to apply absolutely no commercial manners, and I'm speaking from experience. So I think we're much safer to actually deal with the Commission than we are with the merchant services.
That may be the nicest thing said to you all day, Cathy, so revel in it for a little while. We have a question down here. Or a reply to merchant services.
You're welcome, Cathy. I'm taking all the brunt of this from you now. The reason that we're having such kind of tight agenda and legislation against this is because when we're having you mentioned, Paul, there about the risk and the bond going in with that. The reason for that is because when the schemes levy the fines, although the schemes are going towards the merchants, they go directly to the acquirers themselves. So if you were to go bust, which we've had many merchants go out in the last couple of years, if they get their fine for 100,000, 200,000, they just say we're going into liquidation, and they set up the company then as Travel 2.0. We're the ones that are on the hook for that. So the reason we have such kind of tight agendas in something like this is because when the money does, or the ski or where the fines do come in, it's going to be hitting the acquirers first of all. I know it's a pain in the ass for businesses like you, and it's not something that you particularly care about. This is why we're pushing the data security agenda to try and minimise that risk, so that we're not passing on scheme fines to people like yourselves, like smaller businesses, that it could be a business killer if you're getting a big fine for something like that. So that's kind of our agenda essentially on something like that.
Yeah, I suppose though the point just is that it's not a legal requirement that you have chargeback here, but the way it works here is that first call on the bond and the fund, and then the banks come in. I think the point you're making there is that, okay, well, if you then say, okay, I don't want the bond, I don't want the fund, then it comes back to chargeback.
Yeah.
And let's just say chargeback was a legal requirement, and just say that the banks didn't change the rules if we didn't exist. But that would mean then that the turnover to which the bank charge applies to is much higher, because they exclude licensable turnover, I think, when you calculate the charge for the merchant. And so I think what you're saying is it's cheaper dealing with us than dealing with you, I think.
Yeah, like I guess what I'm saying in answer to the question the answer from the lady with GoHop, the consumer doesn't appreciate it, and we could question ourselves whether there's any value in it. But from a business and a commercial point of view, there is value in having the bond, no question.
No, and I agree that the consumer. I agree the consumer along with the merchant wouldn't see a value in that, but it's from our standpoint, it's like driving without a license. You're not going to see a value of it until you see a blue light flashing in the window and all of a sudden you wish you had it. We're also offering, we have liability waivers and things, so if there is a case where there is a breach and you're found to be in compliance with the data security, if a fine comes in for 100,000, we'll take the hit on that because you've been given best practices, which I don't think is offered from any other part of the industry.
Andrew, I'm not trying to make a point, but I'm not talking about fines and nor is Angela. We're talking about, as our turnover grew, you guys just decided we were a bigger risk, and that's what will happen to all of us. Our turnover will be assessed as risk by the merchant providers as against being assessed as a regulatory requirement by the Commission.
And how high does travel rank in your league table of risk? Is it one of the riskier?
It would. This and the hotel industry would be the two kind of main ones, because there's such a high level of exposure for such a long period of time. Now, I know to your point about the merchant service charge, I wouldn't have too much dealing with that. I'm kind of more on the regulatory and a compliance standpoint, so I can't speak with any sort of authority on that. But because you're able to take bookings and able to take payments, recurring payments, in such a large period of time, it will be top of the league table for risk assessment on our side anyway.
Okay.
I think the fact that it is true that people don't inquire about bonding, but having discussions with Cathy, with our board, I mean, we have to have discussions that they might inaugurate a campaign, an advertising campaign, that would promote booking with a licence and bonded travel agent. And I think there's a reasonable commitment on that, Cathy.
Yes, well, obviously, I don't know what budget you have, what budget I have, that's for another day. But I think the point is to get the fund into a reasonable state first and then get out with the message, because you can't go out with the message now because passengers or travellers won't always be covered, so that would be inappropriate advertising. So if we get through this process and then get out there advertising it, because the world will have changed then as well, because, for example, one you give of Ryanair being bonded in or licensed in Germany, which is true, so then if someone's taking a package of them in the future, potentially the information they need is, don't come to us, go to the people in Germany if something goes wrong. Yeah. And that's a completely different sort of message that we're trying to get out.
Should the consumer not know that?
Oh, they should do, but wait till we get our bonds and TPF in good shape first.
Well,
we can debate that maybe.
But that's the point. Like we're trying to express the need to look at, hybrid solutions around auditing, correct figures being submitted to you. We're looking at, this has been driven by one rogue collapse effectively.
Well, except just to say the scheme has been around for 35 years and it has worked. And if I'm not making any excuse about low cost, but if it wasn't this year, it could be 4 or 5 years' time. We don't know. Right. But it was coming towards an end, and it was just a quick case of time. So we would be having this conversation. Maybe not now, but it could be a couple of years.
And we have a question from the floor.
Yeah, Cathy, good to see you. You're very welcome. Thank you for coming along. Just to mention, there was just a brief discussion earlier about how things might have been done slightly differently or better, perhaps. And just, if I may say, from this side of the fence, the perception might be that the CAR is very focused on the administration of the travel regulatory regime. And perhaps, it's 10 years now since I think your predecessor suggested that the annual licensing changed to either biannual or indefinite, as IATA do. that would take an awful lot of the administrative burden off you, and perhaps allow you to move resources to look at the risk element of this regime. And in that context, if you look back at low cost, and from your figures, what's coming across clearly is that the risk is not with the majority of small traders. Your own document says that the current bonding levels are adequate to cover the vast majority of collapses. Yeah. So it's the outliers, it's the riskier ones that you need to watch. And, you know, simple things like a phone call to Aer Lingus to see is so-and-so doing, how many seats are they buying from you guys? And the same from Ryanair, how many seats are they buying? Things like that can be done to establish the trading levels of various companies. And perhaps a bit more time spent on that and a bit less time on the 22-page. When you print it, your application process is 22 pages long. It's would be one thing. I'll let you come back on that in a minute if I can, but there's something else I want to say. And I suppose what's coming across in the options that we've seen here and in the larger documents that we've gotten from Europe Economics and others is that there's an imperative here to get the TPF. I mean, I think that's the only game in town. Get the TPF back up, get it funded quickly. And that seems to be driving the narrative around everything here. And the underlying thing is that it has to include the limited legislative reform for the reasons you've mentioned. But I think it's disappointing not to see, given that you're advising or making recommendations or will be giving a report to the department, which is going to inform them on the legislation that they'll have to write. I think it's disappointing not to see something like, for instance, scrap the current bonding scheme entirely and we'll have a whole new legislation. That's not an option that's being discussed here at all. And I think really, for one who's been trying to get this addressed, the legislation as it stands and how inadequate it is, and trying to get that reformed, and having been told for years, decade even, that we can't do anything about it till the PTD2 comes along. And we now have a reform agenda which doesn't include reform really in that context. It really just focuses on the existing legislation, a rapid fix to refill the TPF, but it actually doesn't address the core problem here. And it doesn't inform the people in the department who either don't know or don't care about this in relation to amending what is a fatally flawed legislation where the micro businesses are funding consumer protection in Ireland, where the mega businesses are not bothered, are involved. I think your role as an advocate, if you like, within the government for yourselves should be more about driving this kind of change and less about let's fill up the TPF quickly and then we'll worry about everything else later on, which seems to be the theme that's coming through.
Is that an option, Cathy, option H or J, to throw your hands in the air and say, oh, this system is unworkable, I'm going to put people out of business if I put these levies in, give me something else to work with?
Okay, starting with the last question first then. As I said at all the meetings and when I met you at the board, these are 5 approaches. And we're not limited to that, I said as well. And I've also said to you individually and in groups, give us your ideas. I know many of you have this idea of charge €1 to everyone at the airport. Okay, that might not work. If it doesn't, come up with some other ideas. So whilst I acknowledge I am trying to get this fund right, but I also want to get a scheme that's right and fair. And so we've had some good input from some of the travel agents already, and we are looking at other things. And as I said the other day, we have had an insurance company. They're making a submission. I haven't seen it yet, and I'm very interested to see what they say. Somebody else referred to some of the things they're doing in the UK. I'll be looking at that too. So I'm open to all. I just we want to solve this problem, so all suggestions are very welcome. In terms of us concentrating on administration, well, as I mentioned there earlier, I am going to be looking at the application process to see, do we really need to know all the answers to all these questions? And then the one thing that you said actually, that I was thinking about last week was I was checking out the law that the licence doesn't have a limit, but the bonding arrangement put in place must be for the period of the licence. So what I'm sort of thinking, and again, I'd love your feedback on this, is well, what for those with cash bonds that maybe you let the licensing period run on longer, but you're going to have more onerous monitoring requirements then to make sure that the bonds are right level. And we have to think hard about it because, as I said earlier on, the one point when we have power is before the licence issued, and the UK say the same thing. And so once you've actually issued the license, it's very difficult then it's quite difficult to actually cancel the license. And so I would be happy to work with some of you to actually work through the possibility of having a more than 1 year license period for those with a cash bond, but with better or more monitoring.
So a 2-year license is what you're talking about?
My background's energy, and in energy the license goes on.
Okay.
And as long as they do certain
yeah.
things. So it was new to me then to come into this industry where you have people applying for a license each and every year. And I understand why, but there is some, I think, we can think more about that idea.
Yeah, I think a quick fix for that would be to have an annual license that's automatically renewed or something like that.
Not a quick fix, we don't want quick fixes.
But something that's automatically renewed, an annual license that's automatically renewed without the whole process of I'm thinking about the administrative burden.
How long does it take, John? How long, or to people in the room, how long does it take, how much of your headspace and your time and your office time does it take to renew this license?
Well, it does take a bit of time. I mean, it's easy to say it doesn't, because one of the things that you have to be mindful is getting the projected turnover accurate. And that's the licensable turnover relative to your turnover. So you have to analyse that. It's not a simple matter of that. And the hidden bit of this that has nothing to do with Cathy is the bonding. You then have to go off and get a bond. Now, in the last 10 years, that has not been easy. And thankfully, the ITAA had the backstop that made that a bit easier. But there's a whole process that goes around the licensing issue. And I think that's quite an onerous thing. Maybe not for guys that have 40 staff and 3 accountants, but for the majority of licensed travel agents, they're very small, very small businesses, and they don't have that luxury. So you're talking about someone coming in on a Sunday to fill out a form, having spent a week trying to get the figures right. Because the last thing we want is to put in a projected licensable figure that makes absolutely no sense, and the commissioner coming back and saying you're trying to pull one over on us here. So you have to get it right, and we're not talking about accountants. We're talking about travel agents, salespeople who are trying to get the figures right, present the balance sheet in a way that makes sense, and that's not going to look like we're trying to fast one on the commission. So it's a stressful time as much as anything else, but it's not a trivial item by any means.
I think the timing of the year, Des, is also because you're doing it in sort of February, Jan, February, March, and I think that's probably I know there's a second round in November 1 as well, which seems to have less stress from the feedback that I would get from a member. So I think anyone that needs to do administration, I mean, if you have no sales, you'll definitely have no administration.
Sorry, just on the online one, that there's 2 here. That we're leaving it off now because I want to find out the total requirements of the Package Travel Directive, and so to do it as one project at that point, because there were certain upgrades we needed to do. So for now, I'm just going to stick with the paper one because it's too costly to make changes, and then maybe have more changes to make. Yeah, I know. But that's the reason why we haven't done it for now. Thanks.
9 minutes on.
Great, okay, Martin's a question as well, Martin Skelly.
Thank you, Martin Skelly from Navan Travel. I'm amazed that in all the submissions and in all the information we receive, or that's made public from CAR, that as people who are fundamentally involved in consumer protection, which we accept which I think you would accept that it is fundamentally your role, why do you never highlight the fact that the majority of customers for whom you're responsible have absolutely no protection? In the presentation, I think you said that there wasn't a particular appetite at the moment for legislative change. You wanted to fix things as they are at the moment, and fix that the priority was to build back up the fund. Why is there not the same enthusiasm to protect 80-85% of the public?
No, as I said, that my concern was that the Package Travel Directive wouldn't be translated into Irish legislation in a timely manner, and to that extent was progressing this piece of work. But if it turns out that the department then decides to do it by an SI, which makes it quicker, then that piece of work can merge into the Package Travel Directive. And because it's within that part of the work that that whole conversation about whether or not Ryanair as a travel agent should be bonded. Now, and as for all I know is for the 15%, we'll make those points in the work that we do. I don't know the calculation of 15%, so I'd be very happy if anyone would share that with me.
And I accept that. And
whatever the figure is.
And none of us know exactly what the figures are. What I'm amazed is that in previous, previously when the car produced their annual report, I've never seen highlighted the fact that as people who are primarily concerned with consumer protection, that they don't highlight the fact that the majority of Irish consumers are not protected.
Well, I think you make a good point there. And like we put out a strategic plan this year. It was the first in a number of years, and we said quite clearly in that the interests of the passenger that's what we're there to protect the travelling public. And to the extent, then we might include that as useful information in our annual report.
Absolutely, and that's good to hear.
Yeah.
But it's still such a gaping hole in everything that has happened for years and years and years, and we haven't heard anything to suggest that you're very concerned about it. Now, you are, but we've never heard a suggestion to say that we'll call it 80%. 80% of Irish customers have absolutely no protection, no financial protection when they travel. As a Commission, we have a concern about that. I've really never heard it. And I think a lot of us in the room would probably feel much more inclined to run behind everything that you do if we felt that in spirit you wanted to see all Irish customers protected.
I tell you what,
it's such a gaping hole year after year. And when we heard I don't mean to cut across, but when we heard your presentation today, you didn't say that. You know, there was something that legislative change was something that was a little bit further away. I would see that as an absolute priority and an immediate priority.
Well, can you leave that with me as to how we include that sort of message in the work that we do, because it is an important message, and can you leave that with me?
Completely independently of what's happening in this room, do you see the duty of care requirements on airlines, which are being upped very, very slightly? Do you see them coming more in line to that airlines are now being asked by European consumer legislation to provide something like the duty of care that the travel agents have been doing since 1981?
Well, that's quite a legal question, isn't it? I know they do have a duty.
They're kicking and screaming against it.
Well, they do have the duty of care under this EC 261, as we've all heard about in the last couple of weeks.
Which is changing by the month almost in terms of requirements.
Well, no, the requirements are there, and as I said, over the last few weeks, there's certain areas that are open to interpretation, and and that will eventually get ironed out, I would have thought, through the courts or whatever it is. But on that one, we'll be just learning from Ryanair. We'll be working with some of the other airlines to see what information they would provide to passengers if the same event were to happen to them, and maybe bring a little bit more clarity to that. But in terms of whether that equates with the same duty of care that the travel agents has, I'm not sure I can answer that.
It won't for a long time. It's getting clear. I'm going to wrap it up now, unless there's one more question. We have very privileged to have Cathy here. We won't have her again, so she will run. She will flee. She will flee from the building screaming. So, thank you, Cathy. I really appreciate you coming and taking the fire, standing in the line of fire. Thank you to our very informed panel and our very informed questioners. You really gave us everything this afternoon. I'm very happy that the session got a couple of answers and got a couple of questions out of the way. Thank you very much, guys.